Welcome to Quilting's first reality show, live and unscripted, with Susan Smith.
Isn't that grand? Okay, now I can put my glasses on. I didn't for the intro because we actually are having a really sunny day today. And I have a diffuser curtain on the window which is facing me, but as you see, there's going to be glare in my glasses. So I'm sorry about that, but I can't quilt without them. So, alrighty, today's project is going to be a lap size quilt. You're seeing the backing here. It's a pieced, there we go. It's a pieced backing. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things to watch for when you're loading a pieced backing. And then the quilt itself is kind of autumn colors, which is not surprising looking at this, but it has lots of different colors in it. So we'll talk a little bit about thread choices. And then the actual quilting is going to be a topographical meander. So a nice masculine pattern, which honestly aren't thick on the ground. So you'll want to get this one in your toolbox. But let's start loading. Okay, my backing is pieced very nicely, smoothly, pieced so that it's very flat and square. So I have no problems with it there. In the process though, this belongs to my client, Laura. You've probably seen me do her quilts before. Her blocks are, what's the word I want? Symmetrical. They're centered. They're not just random piecing. So I want to do my best to center the quilt both from side to side and from top to bottom, just because it will look better as an almost reversible quilt, right? So obviously as I'm quilting, I can see from side to side. That's easily done. Of course, I can't see both the top and the bottom while I'm quilting. So I laid it out beforehand on the floor and centered my quilt top to bottom. And I just put a pin in my backing where I want my top to line up. So you'll see that as I'm loading it. So that's really all the prep that I've done. So let's get started. And while I talk and load, let me remind you of a couple other things. This show is made possible by your support. And the easiest way to support, if you wish to, is through buymeacoffee.com/stitched by Susan. There you are able, for the price of one coffee, to offer some support to this show, or if you choose to, even offer a monthly commitment of support. And I sure appreciate it. It is truly what makes this possible. We have upgraded our cameras and Dave's recording table. He's got such a sleek little operation going on over there. And so we really, really appreciate you helping us to get a better and better production. What else did I want to say, Dave? Oh, yes. Don't forget in your quilting to have a listen to my podcast. You can find all the episodes at podcast.stitchedbysusan.com, and they are interviews with other quilters and crafters. So they're just light conversations, but often really encouraging, and all kinds of different stories. But I should talk a little bit about this loading as I'm doing it too. One thing that I'm watching for, because I do not have a selvage edge, let me say that differently. If I did have a selvage edge, I often prefer to put it on this front edge because there's so little stretch to it. I know that it's straight and I know that it's not going to stretch out of shape. All of these are cut edges. They're straight, but they are still cut, so they have a certain amount of give. So as I snapped it on here, or even if you're pinning, be careful that you don't overstretch it, right? So be looking at this quilt backing kind of as a whole and making sure it is, the seam lines are staying straight and none of them are pulled and distorted. So I wanted to make sure of that. You might go so far as measuring the width of it when there's no tension on it, and measuring the width here and maybe put a pin on each end, so that you're confident. I'm doing it by eye. Again, I've done a ton of quilts. I'm comfortable with that. But if you need some guardrails, that's a good way to do it. All right, coming around to the other side of the quilt, where you often get a good view of the back of my head. So I'm just pulling the rest of the backing over the rails of my quilting machine and letting it hang down. And I'm taking care that it is pulled straight. So you can see if I pull a little to the left, even a half an inch, I start getting these ripples. I'm watching out for that. I want this to be as straight as possible. That's what enables me to avoid the whole centering process, finding the center of the leader and the center of the backing and all that, is that I load it on here as straight as I can, and then I just roll it up. Okay, so that's what we're going to do next. I have to take my little clamps off. 1 second here while I organize my stuff. All right, and I'm just pulling that backing straight forward, rolling it onto the front rail, and I'm watching underneath for when the lower edge of that backing is approaching my leader. And then I walk around to the back and just affix the second side. So once again, I'm making sure this is smoothed out, but not stretched out. And I just advance it far enough so that I can see and reach to attach my grippers. I do indeed love my red snappers. I think Dave will probably put a link in the notes for you too. This is not an affiliate link. I don't get anything for recommending them, but the shop that we recommend for you is the place that actually makes them. So if you have questions about them, they're a good source to ask the questions. I love the snappers for their efficiency time-wise. They do take a certain amount of hand strength, but it is quite possible to use this same basic method and be pinning it at both ends, but still this method of just rolling it on straight, it works too. So if red snappers are not your thing, not your jam, use your own fastening device, but use the same straight on method. Okay. Oh, apparently there are questions about the backing. Let's take those. I'm not seeing the question screen, Dave. Okay, I'm ready. Diane, is the back pieced on a serger? It is not. It is pieced on a sewing machine, and all the seams are pressed open, which I like because there are so many intersections. If they were pressed to one side, those would be quite bulky lumps in the finished quilt, I think. I like to keep the back as smooth as possible, so I always do the seams open, and so does Laura. Sue, are the back seams pressed for flat or open? Got it. We answered that one. All right. So I am loading on the batting. My all-time favorite, Hobbs 8020, and it was laying on the floor overnight, and of course it has picked up little bits of stuff. You know how it is. No matter how often you vacuum your sewing studio, there are still threads and things. So I'm just picking them off because I do not want them inside the quilt. There we go. So the batting is my all-purpose favorite, Hobbs 8020. The 80 is cotton, the 20 is poly. It is a batting that is kind of a medium loft. It drapes really nicely. It washes beautifully, and it's very cost effective. It is my go-to batting. Okay, and now I've got the quilt. And Laura tells me this pattern is called an old-fashioned quilt. So if anyone's wanting to make one like it. And it needs to go this way. So when all other things being equal, I prefer to load my quilts with the length running from side to side, just because that means fewer advances and passes of my quilt. So it's more efficient. There are reasons for not doing that. If the quilting is directional, or maybe the seams on the backing might indicate it would be easier to load it vertically. But if all of the things are equal, this is the way I prefer to go. Okay, let's talk thread for a minute now that you can see the top. I grabbed some choices here. As you can see, this quilt has a number of colors in it, and I didn't even pick a green one. I could have. Can they be seen? Is this better? There we go. So all these colors are represented in the quilt, and all of them honestly would be okay choices. When I'm choosing a thread for a multicolored quilt, I just think about what I want the final look to be. And for me, usually the look is I want the thread to blend as much as possible across all the fabrics. So I would not be likely to choose a red because it's going to disappear in those few red fabrics, and it's going to show up a lot in some of these lighter cream colored fabrics. So for me, that's why I would not choose the red. Although if you liked the red and you wanted your quilting to show, it would certainly be an option. So kind of for the same reason, the gold. It's a very beautiful color. It would certainly be an acceptable option, but I'm choosing to go a little more low key. And honestly, the dark brown, sort of same thing. So this cinnamon is what I finally chose. And it is lighter than basically the red, the gold, and the brown. So it's kind of on the light side, but I feel like it will blend the most evenly across all the fabrics. And also, the design I've chosen, the topographical meandering, is kind of an earthy design, right? So again, to me, the red kind of doesn't say earthy organic design. The cinnamon does. So that's just my choice. I don't think any of these would be wrong. You have options. But the cinnamon's what I chose for today. So let's get all those out of the way and start quilting. Come on, Lucy. My long arm, by the way, is named Lucy. It is a Gamel 26-inch throat. That's what I'm quilting on. Okay, we have a question or two. Susan, do you do anything special to get creases or wrinkles out of your batting? Well, I buy mine on a giant roll because I use a lot of it, so I don't usually have that problem, but occasionally clients will bring in batting, and that can be quite distorted. So my trick, especially with Hobbs 80/20, because it can stand a bit of heat, is I throw it in my dryer with a wet towel. And just, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes with heat in the dryer will lessen those wrinkles. I have not found a way to get them out altogether, but it will soften them enough that I can get the batting flat. Is that it for questions? Okay, we're going to start stitching. So I have a pop-up Facebook group going right now, and we're having conversations about different things, and one of them is basting. So yesterday we were talking about whether or not, well, I was giving tips for doing this perimeter basting, and one lady was just saying, that's just one too many things to think of. You know, I'm just trying to get the hang of quilting. And I can certainly appreciate where she's at, but thinking about it overnight, I feel like this is one of the first things you do want to take the time to learn how to do. It's pretty foundational in achieving a quilt that's anything like square. So all I'm doing is stitching up the left side, across the top, and down the right side. And this establishes the size and the squareness of this area of the quilt. So that's why I think it's foundational. If you don't do it and you just start quilting, I guarantee you, your quilting is going to pull in the fabric from the sides of the quilt. You know, it'll still be a useful quilt, absolutely. But I do think this is an early skill you want to master. I'm lucky I have a channel lock on my machine, which means just at the push of a button, I can lock magnets on the rails. So right now my machine is stitching a perfectly horizontal line, and I can, with my fingers, just fine tune moving the edge of the quilt so that it stays straight with the stitching. Does that make sense? And then I have a beautiful straight horizontal line across the top. And then I can change it to vertical, and my machine stitches a perfect vertical line. So I now know that my corners are 90 degrees, my edges are straight, and my left and right are parallel to each other. And it's a pretty satisfactory result, honestly. And we're ready to start quilting. I'm just going to tuck my clamps onto the left and right side. Which one can they see the best, Dave? Okay, so I'm using clamps that come with the Red Snapper system. Well, with is maybe too strong a word. It's a separate purchase, but they're made by the same people. What I like about them is that they're long. I like to use the longest clamp that I can fit in this area of my machine so that I get nice even tension all the way. So, you know, if you have something else that's not this brand, or can find something else, my clamp is stuck. Hang on a sec. I'm not stuck on the brand necessarily, although I'm happy with this brand. But the feature that I like is this length right here, as opposed to just using this little clamp, which is what came with my machine, and it would just put tension right there. You can see that. So that's what I like about those clamps, is how wide they are. So I put one on each side, and I'm just pulling enough tension on there to keep the quilt smooth. It is not a drum by any means. I don't want to treat it like one. It's just a wee bit fiddly to get those seam allowances in my clamps. Just a little bit fiddly. I think I got it. So just enough tension to hold it smooth. And I'm going to cheat. I'm just going to run right back up this side of basting and start quilting in this closest corner. There we go. So, on the basting? Yeah, let's take a basting question. Whew, those glasses are shiny. Kelly, do you use your channel locks all the way down the sides as you go? Usually, yes, Kelly. How deeply do we want to go here? We might as well talk about it. When you do roll a quilt, it tends to, the area that you've quilted tends to want to pull in a little bit. So depending on how much quilting, depending on how big it is kind of how far I go with this. But I will sometimes literally massage my back roller, my quilted area, to sort of stretch it out again. Because if I just start where my basting ended, put a channel lock on and stitch down, almost always the top edge will be more toward the center of my quilt, and it will be angling out toward the bottom. Is that making sense? Because my quilted area is pulling in. So I work at pulling that quilting area out, and if I can't get it out far enough, then I just eyeball my edge or use a ruler on the edge, because it actually has a tiny bit of angle to it. But the end result is square. Does that all make sense? I do kind of fudge things as I go. I'll be honest about that. Okay, let's start quilting. Oh, one more thing. Magnets. You guys have seen these. They are magnetic bars. I just got mine from the hardware store. I even have a couple of different brands. They're the type that you would hang kitchen knives on or tools in your garage. And because my rails are iron, they hold beautifully. So I put them along the front edge, because now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 secured edges of my quilt. And I can quilt my heart out in this area and it's not going anywhere. So that's what we're going to do. This is very much a wing it kind of design. But essentially, as you can see, it's a glorified spiral. I'm spiraling my way in and spiraling my way back out. And that's it. So I call these sessions live and unscripted because obviously we're airing them live. You get to see things in real time. But they are not specifically classes. So I'm not really going to teach you, break down the design and teach it. I more want you to be able to get the big picture. I want you to see the whole quilt and how I'm moving around the entire thing, much more than getting too caught up in the design. But if you're already comfortable moving around a quilt top, by all means, glean what you can of this design and go try it on your own. I know pantographs exist that are similar to this, and honestly, that's what gave me the idea, and I thought, gosh, I can do that freehand, easy peasy. And as I said earlier, masculine designs are sometimes hard to think of, and so whenever I find one like this, I latch onto it. It's a great choice for a quilt for a guy. And my quilting lines are probably 1/2 to 5/8 of an inch apart, mostly. And that is completely variable. I would just try to keep it semi-consistent throughout the quilt. So if you're starting it with 1/4 inch meandering, keep on with that. If you're starting with 1 inch, you know, that will give you the best textural look at the end, keeping fairly consistent with that spacing. But as you can see, it's quite random. It's pretty forgiving. One thing I do try to focus on is to not make rows of these boxes. So I purposely make them very oddly shaped. That's just my personal preference. I don't think it would look as topographical if the boxes were kind of squarish and in rows. So what do you all think? Did I choose the right thread color and the right design? And maybe a fun little exercise here would be to think of what other designs would work on this quilt. Because of course I don't think there's only one right way to quilt a project. If we want it to be a masculine quilt, we could very easily have done something leafy, or wood grain would be another fun one. Maybe even loopy. I love doing loops and then adding kind of drop-in little elements. So we could have gone loopy and dropped in pine cones here and there. There's any number of ways that we could quilt this that would be attractive with all these autumnal colors. So I'm curious if some of you have an idea for what you might have quilted on this. Another great feature of this design is it's very easy to just echo to travel. So if I want to work in a different area than where I am, I can decide right here, do I want to go up or do I want to go down? And I can just travel alongside whatever was there before. And I could do that across a whole huge area if I wanted to, and it just feels like part of the design. So one more way that it's a really forgiving and nice design to quilt. You don't get locked into an area at all. So right here, I'm going to do a whole bunch of traveling to get back to an area that I see is getting kind of pinched and narrow. And it's super easy. Just travel along with an echo. And there we are, one pass finished. Should I move my camera though, Dave? Well, I'll move Lucy so you guys can see a little better and I can get in the better overhead camera. I'll just break thread, it's the easiest thing in the world. Okay, let's take a question or two. Allison, request, in between passes, could you pan across the bottom of the previously quilted pass so we can see how deeply you scallop the bottom or top of each quilting pass to mesh them together? Sure, I'll do that right now if Dave will put the close camera on. Ah, Dave is saying it's hard to see the thread. Okay, so my first one, I can see where my basting ended way down here, and I didn't drop that far down. I mean, it cost me nothing but possibly one more pass in the end, right? So here's basically where I'm going. Are you able to see that? A little lower, a little higher. My finger was going too fast. Can you see that? So the total variation is perhaps as much as 2 inches. Am I going too fast again? That gives you an idea. So I'm just taking off all my clamps and preparing to advance. Maybe I will advance just a little less because I think it gets difficult for you all to see if I'm right up at the top. And quite honestly, it's also difficult for me to quilt at arm's length. All right, so let's have an overhead view again, and I'll talk just a little bit about adjusting batting as I go. So you can see when I've advanced, this is all kind of rumpled here. So if I just pull the quilt, my experience is that the batting in the middle pulls up faster than it does at the edges. So every time I advance, I make it a habit to either grab the batting also and tug them, or if you're not confident in that, literally flip the quilt up because this edge is floating. It's not attached, right? And you can visibly see that batting and make sure it's smooth and there's no, you know, excess kind of getting in there. And you can even look at the front edge of the batting if you want to and make sure that it's not getting that frowny shape going on after you've done a couple of passes. Smooth it all out. Now, if you've watched other episodes, you know that sometimes I have a long tape measure stretched along the top and I'm literally measuring as I go. Laura's quilt is pretty darn square and pretty flat. And also it's just going to be a lap quilt. It's not a show quilt. So I'm just going to eyeball it And it's pretty safe to say I can still have it within a 1/4 inch of square, which I think is a satisfactory result. You do you, but that works for me. And here's where I think it was Kelly was asking about, do I put my channel lock on the right? This is where if I saw pulling happening here, I would literally be walking along on the other side of my machine and kind of massaging this out and tugging it, because you can literally pull that back out a little flatter. Does that make sense? So it just depends on the quilt sometimes, how many of those efforts you need to go to, how many steps you need to take. It will depend on the fabric, it will depend on the type of quilting you're doing, how much it pulls in. There's lots of factors, but it is a good thing to be aware of. I personally tend to eyeball stitching this edge. But again, you can fiddle with your channel lock, you can use a ruler if that helps you, whatever works for you. I tend to just eyeball it. And I'll go ahead and put my clamp on the right hand edge while I'm over here. And I mentioned at the beginning, I'm attempting to get my quilt centered from left to right as well. So it's very visible and easy to see. I can see how much of my backing is extending beyond the quilt on each side. So I'm keeping my quilt centered. And if everything is loaded square, that should sort of happen from your initial centering. But, you know, just another thing to keep in the back of your mind and keep gauging. Honestly, I think that's a huge part of getting lovely square results from your quilts. It is cumulative. And so, you know, some of it has to do with the piecing, some of it has to do with the pressing, but from your point of view as the quilter, you just keep an eye on things. I don't know how best to say it, but we're talking about, you know, the squunching up of the quilt that's already quilted. Another thing that I always look at is my seam lines that are running horizontally. Like, are they straight? Are they dipping anywhere or slanting down anywhere? I'm just always looking, assessing, gauging, and making small adjustments. And that way it never gets away from me and I don't have, you know, 2 inches of weirdness at the bottom edge. And one last clamp. And here's a little tip. If you have a backing that's got seam allowances, as this one does, sometimes just a pin in your hand will help to tuck those seam allowances into the channel. Whatever style you're using, there's always some type of channel you're putting the fabric into. So the pin tip can be helpful there. There we go. I'm not quilting too close to the edge here, but if I was, this is another maybe that I sometimes do, my trusty yardsticks. Can you see where that is? I can show you. Here's the stick. It's just going to lay across the rails, but underneath the strap of my clamp. So, and I can adjust it left or right depending on how much lift I need to get. I don't need very much this time. I might not even need it at all, but we'll put it in there. And what that's doing is preventing Lucy from hitting this clamp as I come over to the edge. And the closer you're quilting to the edge, the more that starts to matter. Sure, let's do a few questions and I will get me a sip of coffee. As I mentioned earlier, this show is made possible by your support through buymeacoffee.com, because you know I love my coffee. Okay. Kelly, yes, thank you for the explanation. That makes great sense. I would have never thought to massage out the already quilted area. Great tip, you rock. Honestly, Kelly, I have to give credit for that one to another quilter, and lots of the tips that I have are like that. Like, we quilters share, right? So I'm not the magician about quilting, but you do get, because you're watching in real time, you get to see me applying these things. So that's my hope with this show, is that it all comes together. All right. Gabrielle, I struggle with lighting. I have lights everywhere and I'm apparently blind when it comes to the stitching I put down, which then leads to unquilting. Advice, experience, tips to share. I mean, you've tried lots of lights, and honestly, sometimes more lights is not the answer. If your machine has a black light, give that a whirl. And the very hardest quilts I've ever done, I actually turned off all the lights, machine lights, room lights, overhead bar lights, everything. And I stood a floor lamp to one side and cast a strong side light. So I was literally seeing the shadows, and that's what made it possible to see. I did one quilt for a client really not that long ago, maybe a year, that had kind of dark, rich colors and also fine prints. And I literally could not see. And the brighter I made the light, sort of the worse it got, almost reflective. And so that whole side shadow thing can be helpful. I know there are quilters who have small LED lights affixed to the sides of their machine for the same reason. However you can make the light work, do it, but that side light can be really helpful. Okay, Sue, thanks for explaining the basting. If you were doing a dense custom design in blocks, would you baste the whole quilt first? Yes, I would. And if you happen to be in my Facebook pop-up group, which is called Freehand Quilting Intensive, if you want to find it, you can reach out to me and I'll help you get in there today. That was a topic today, was when it's appropriate to baste the whole quilt. So even that can take several forms. It can mean basting, lines across every so often, maybe every 12 inches, maybe every 6 inches. And I've known quilters who actually do a basting zigzag so that there's only small areas that can shift, right? And the whole area would be exposed. So when you're quilting, it can't get distorted. So yes, the more dense custom quilting you're doing, the higher level basting you need to do. Lori, about how big are the squares or boxes of each topographical design? Oh gosh, I would say they're at least 4 and they run up to 7 or 8, especially when they're odd triangular shapes, something like that. Wendy, thanks for admitting you fudge. Of course I do. I mean, that's like the first talent a quilter needs to develop, is how to make it look good, even when it's not perfect. Joey, I agree, I could watch Susan quilt all day. Does anyone else see fabrics that are in your stash? I do, quite a few. Probably true, Joey, because I'm sure Laura made this from scraps in her stash. And quilting lines get released to all the stores across the country, maybe even around the world at the same time each year. Pretty cool. Okay. One more sip for Susan, and we're on our way. Now, I make it a habit to alternate the direction of my passes. So the first pass I started in the right-hand corner and quilted left. Now I'm going to start left and quilt right. This design is not particularly directional, but if I'm quilting flowers, for example, they tend to face one way. So if I alternate my passes, it makes the whole quilt look more the same, right? And not all of it leaning in one direction. So I just make it a habit to do that so that I don't forget. There is another question apparently. Let's have it. Laurel, I read that and wondering how you get that 1-inch basting. I don't know how I can do that on my HQ. So my current machine does have a basting stitch and I can vary the length, but I actually choose not to use it because somehow the needle doesn't come fully out of the fabric right. So Laurel, I literally put my channel lock on and I just take single stitches with my button. I just go stitch, 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 stitch every inch across the quilt. It's not fancy. And if you don't have channel lock, just guess, like your basting line does not have to be straight. Just do a straight-ish line across the quilt for basting. And that probably makes it easier, honestly, if you're trying to do a zigzag or a wave type of basting. Just one stitch at a time across the quilt. So that triangle right there is about 6 inches from side to side and a little over 4 from top to bottom at the widest point. It's not really a triangle, it's like a rhombus or something. You certainly could do them bigger. The bigger they get, the more apt you are to get yourself into a kind of pinched little area. But it doesn't hurt anything to go bigger. That'll just be a bigger mountain in your landscape, right? here, I'm going to echo way back over. See how slick that works? When you view the finished quilt at the end, that will just feel like part of the design. If you look at an actual topographical map, they tend to have much more elongated and stretched out areas that, you know, indicate the hillsides and things. So I keep kind of playing with that. I find that can be difficult to quilt, to find my way back out of the spiral, but I like the look of it. So I keep playing a bit with that. So if you need some inspiration, yeah, just go find your topographical map. You can see here, I'm going to have a really long stretched one in just a second. Right here. And I quite like the look of that. Something that helps with scale and how, you know, whether or not to squeeze in another line, like in that skinny space I still quilted, is keeping your eye on the scale of your quilting. So for example, I said earlier that for the most part, I'm keeping my lines 1/2 to 5/8 of an inch apart. That varies quite a bit, but I don't have any areas that have, for example, 2 inches. So that little loop-de-loop that I was quilting into a moment ago was about 2 inches wide. And so I said to myself, I can't leave that. That will catch the eye. Unquilted areas puff up and catch the eye. So that's how I gauge. Do I need to fit in another thing or don't I? Just has to do with the overall scale of the thing I'm quilting. I think it was Allison that asked how deep of nesting I'm leaving. I'm not being super careful about that, Allison, just because these are so irregularly shaped anyways that they're not going to look like a row when it's done. No matter what I do, honestly. I've experimented too with how wobbly to make my lines or whether to keep them smoother curves. I don't really have an answer for you. It's just one of the things that you can adjust and fiddle with. But those little changes can make a difference in the overall appearance, so you might want to practice drawing it out times first and experiment with that a bit. I'll tell you what, this is much easier to quilt than a meander. I found quilting a meander or a stipple to be incredibly difficult to learn. It seems to me because it's always changing directions. You know, you're always making that dog bone kind of shape and changing directions. This one, I think, is ever so much easier, because it is really, as I said, a glorified spiral, and you're always going around it in the same way. And here again, I'm traveling. All right, good time to type in your questions. And as I was quilting that pass, I realized I did not load another bobbin, get it started. So I'm gonna do that quickly now while you guys type in any questions that you may have. I do prefer to use the same thread top and bottom whenever I can. In terms of like size and weight of thread, I pretty much always do that just because it saves me a lot of tension headaches. But even for color, I like them to be the same or at least pretty closely related, so you don't see tips of other colors of thread showing through the quilting. So I tend to load my own bobbins for that reason, and it just takes a matter of a jiffy to get a new one started. So I'm back. Any questions? All right, you guys have just got the hang of this. No questions? Apparatus here. And this time I've chosen to just leave my needle down because Lucy's on the right side there. So it's just riding forward with my quilt. And this is the last pass already. So again, Putting a little tug on that batting to make sure there's no excess rumples under there. Tugging my quilt square and straight, looking at it kind of from all angles to make sure that it is in fact straight. And apparently there is a question now. Let's see. Our blessed house, today are you using regulated stitching? What stitch length? I do have regulated on today, and I've got it on at 11. I more often do 12, honestly, but I started with 11, so I decided to just continue with it. Certain designs I like to do with constant stitch. You guys don't see me doing that very much because I find it hard to do constant stitch and talk at the same time. It's one too many things to focus on. So you guys mostly see me quilting and regulated, but I do love to use constant stitch when I'm doing this kind of work. It just, I don't know, something about that rhythm is more soothing. I like the sound of it better, and I sort of get in the groove better. That might be just me, but I sure encourage all quilters to give it a try. It's nothing to be scared of. I made it to the front. I thought I might not have quite enough room. So I do like to use, again, my channel lock on the front because it helps me get a straight edge, and I'm adjusting with my fingers as I go so that I do get a perfectly straight edge. And I'm going to move it up just a teeny tiny hair. There we go. If you don't have the horizontal channel lock, then I think I would recommend pinning this edge so that you make sure it's straight, because it can very easily get away from you if you're just winging it across there. And you probably can't see this from the angle you're watching, but I'm keeping an eye this way on my quilt to make sure these seams are not stretching this way as I'm stitching. I'm making sure it's feeding under the hopper foot so that these seams that I can see with my eye as I'm quilting are staying straight. So I'm not using a ruler or measuring device for that. It's just something I'm assessing all the time as I'm quilting. It's a bit like driving. Like, you just got to be aware of these other things that are going on. If you don't look up at all and you're just stitching this little hem edge, you know, you might be veering off to the left by ½ inch, and you don't want to do that. So I'm making sure there's no ripples out in front of me that need to be managed, and if there are, I manage them. I don't let them just push out ahead. So that was the channel lock on all the way across, and you can see how even that came. That's within a 1/16 of an inch all the way across there. So I'm satisfied with that. I know my corners are square, so it's going to be a nice square quilt. And here I am going to break thread because I want to start my stitching on the right hand side this pass. So break thread, send Lucy down there to the other end, and get our clamps on. There are a couple questions. Let me just get this one clamp on, and then I will look up. Oops. Come on now. There we go. Okay, I'm ready. I'm not brave enough to run over pins as I don't have a horizontal channel lock. What can I do to secure the fabric? Well, I mean, you can take out the pins as you come to them. I use corsage pins, which are pretty sturdy. I have always quilted over my pins. I have never broken a pin or a needle so far, so I encourage you to try it. You're going at a slow pace, right? You're not whizzing over the pins, so there's time for them to shift as your needle bobs up and down. Otherwise, you just pull them out as you come to them. Joan, first time that I found you. I'm also a Gamel girl with a Gamel 26-inch Vision 2. Nice. From Richland, Washington. I'm wondering if perhaps we're almost neighbors. Well, we probably are if you're in Richland. I'm in Spokane. So, pretty close, yes. More questions, Dave, or is that it? That's it for questions. Okay. One more clamp to put on, and we're on to, I should have kept my pin in my hand. We're on to the last pass. So, let's do our little rundown of things again. I try to post photographs as soon as I have some good lighting, which is usually morning lighting in my studio. So within a day or two, I'll try and post some photographs on my social media of this quilt done so that you get the big picture view. Which camera am I on, hun? This? Yeah, there we go. So you get the big picture view of kind of what the texture looks like. And, you know, watching me quilt is one big picture view, but that's another one. So I will post pictures of it. And we will upload this to YouTube, so you'll be able to come back and watch it if you wish. I would so appreciate if you would like and subscribe and share this with any of your quilty friends that you think would enjoy this style of quilting. I go live the first and third Friday of every month with this same type of project, just real time, reality show, whatever happens, happens. Whatever challenges are in the project that I'm working on, that's kind of the thing I talk about as I'm working through it. So my hope is that it's just like welcoming you into my studio and you just kind of get a feel for some of the things that maybe you've never seen done in real time. Most instructional videos are, you know, edited, and you just see certain parts of it and you don't really see it all stitched together, so to speak. So I hope that that's what this can be for you. And don't forget to have a listen to the podcast. It's called Measure Twice, Cut Once, and you can find all the episodes at podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. It's easy listening for while you're quilting. Well, that's going to be a crazy shaped one. Here I am fudging it for the lady that was admiring my fudging abilities. I didn't want to stop and change direction sharply, so I'm just winging it. It will all look good in the end. There we go, we filled it in. Maybe this is a good time to give a few thank yous while I quilt. First and foremost, of course, is to my husband Dave, who's the genius behind all the technology that's involved here. That is not my strong suit, so he takes care of that whole part of it. And also our good friend Dan, who is the guitar player that graciously lets us use his music on these shows. And it is so lovely. And we're out of bobbin thread. Look at that timing. Just between comments. So I have a not very scientific method of determining when my bobbin will run out, which is to say I just keep stitching till it ends. And then I just back up a couple of inches, just because those last few inches haven't had proper tension on the bobbin thread, right, as it was pulling out of the bobbin. So I just back up 2 or 3 inches, or to a place where I think my little overlap will be unobtrusive. I am typically not a thread barrier, you know, knotting and burying the threads so that they're absolutely invisible. I'll show you what I do in a second. But to begin with, I drop my seam ripper at the spot so that I can find it when I come back. X marks the spot, or in this case, blue seam ripper marks the spot. You wouldn't believe how hard it can be to find that splice sometimes otherwise. Many of you have asked if I check bobbin tension every time. I don't. I have a TOA gauge. I mean, honestly, I've done so many bobbins, I do it a lot by feel. And also, I'm very aware of what my stitching looks like on the top and also how my thread is feeding. And I can usually see if there's something wrong with the tension. Either my stitches will look awkward on top, or the thread, as it's feeding in the top, will be bubbling a little bit where I know it shouldn't be. And I very, very, very seldom have a problem that I'm not aware of. Okay, so I was going to talk about reattaching this. How can we see? Can we do close camera for a sec, Dave? And I'll show you a thread change. Can you see this right here? Pretty well. So I'm just overlapping about 3 stitches. And I've pulled up my bobbin thread. Well, let me just show that for you, just in case there's some of you here who haven't done this. So I'm hanging onto the top thread. I take 1 stitch. That pulls up a loop of bobbin thread, and I just grab it and pull it to the surface and hang on to both of them, okay? And then I'm just going to take 3 or 4 stitches in really close succession on top of that stitching line and then launch into my new stitches. And when I get back close to it, oh, I won't really be close to it again to show you it. It's pretty darn unobtrusive, and I think is really serviceable for your average quilt. Tying and burying threads is a wonderful skill, but I don't think the time investment is necessary for most quilts. The little lock stitch works really, really well. But I am going to pause for a second and cut those threads before I forget. And I just snip them with my little curved scissors very close, and nobody will ever know. Well, this is the final pass, so if you have any more questions, now is a good time to be bringing them up. I feel like I'm concentrating hard and breathing heavily into the microphone. I hope that's not happening. You guys would tell me if I was, wouldn't you? I'm really happy with this choice of kind of cinnamon colored thread. I think my second choice would have been the gold, honestly, just because it was such a pretty color. I usually try to keep doing more quilting at the top and having more open areas at the bottom so I don't kind of paint myself into a corner like I've done here. So I was kind of seeing that happening out of the corner of my eye, but knowing the ease of this design, I just remembered to leave enough space to do one more weird shaped block in there and leave it. But that's something you might remember when you're doing it, is to do more work at the top end. Because that's the most common thing about painting yourself into a corner, right? Is that you quilt kind of in front of an area and then you've got to get back to an area. And remember, with this one, you can travel super easily. So if you're worried about that painting into a corner, just travel all the way back to the top and lay some more quilting down in there. I do think that a big old chunk of freehand edge-to-edge quilting like this is getting to the place where your eye can glance up and take stock of where you're at, that kind of peripheral vision, even while you're stitching. And it becomes second nature after a while. And if it doesn't feel second nature, there's no harm in pausing like this and just looking up and taking stock of where you're at and where you want to go next. Just to show you that you don't have to end right in the corner, I'm going to go fill in the corner first and then end a little ways over on that bottom edge. Again, I'm just keeping a weather eye out for the areas that still need to be covered. But we'll go ahead and do this corner now. Let's see, I think we'll do 2 more chunks. It was a bit long and skinny to make it 1 chunk. So there's 1, and here comes the last one. And there it is. Do some extra little overlap stitching there within the basting, and we are finished. Okay, quilters, I will take down the apparatus. Fire your questions at me if you've got them. Let me know what you think of this design, what you think even of my color choice for thread. I'm seeing a different screen here. I'm going to grab my coffee cup, ladies. What do you think? It's all done. I'll take my glasses off so that I don't get that terrible window glare. Let's see. Okay. Our Blessed House, will you be teaching this topographical pattern in your master class? It's not in the master class, actually. The class was done and published before I did this one. I do have a thought in my mind about ways to be making single patterns available in the future, or it may be added to the master class in the future. Not sure, but for now, it's not in there. Long answer to your very short question, sorry. Allison, my aha moment, training my brain to switch on the fly between the final quilting density, say 1/2 inch, and the interim quilting density, 1 inch in this example. Leave room to exit the spiral. Yes. And so that's kind of how I think of it too. 1 inch on the way in, 1/2 inch on the way out. You know, if. Okay, that's it for questions. Wow, you guys got this one in a minute. And it really is super easy and super forgiving. I encourage you to give it a try. Make it your own. Yours will probably look different than mine, just like your handwriting looks different from mine, but that's okay. This just gives you a starting place of where to begin with it. And it is a great design for the guys in your life. So, okay, what else? One more time, like and subscribe, share this channel, click the bell if you would like to be notified when upcoming live events are on the horizon. YouTube will kindly do that for you. And buy me a coffee, let me get that right, buymeacoffee.com/Stitched by Susan is a really great way to support this show. We do appreciate your help. Everything that comes in there we put toward new cameras, new lighting, to try and make a better and more clear and instructive production for you. So we sure do appreciate that. And yes, today was the 3rd Friday of February, so I'll be back the 1st Friday of March with another quilt. I try to post pictures on my Facebook page and in my newsletter of what's upcoming, but I don't always know till a day or two before what quilt is in my studio that would have some instructive elements to it. So stay tuned for that. It's a little bit different every time, so I hope you will join me again.